I know, deep, right? Sit back, relax. How are we doing?
I'm trying
You're
to.
getting the sun now, aren't you?
Yeah,
it's like Spanish Inquisition right now.
Maybe I'll slide over a little bit here.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
Great. So, thank you for joining us. Before we dive in, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and your journey at Adidas?
Sure. Brian Davis. I lead our global payment fraud and risk team. Been with the brand for about 12 and a half years, starting first in North America, where I led the operations and payment risk space within the Americas. Then moved over to Europe for a couple of years and led that team there, the 19 countries or so that we were operating within. And then in 2019 moved back to the US, but taking on a global role where I now lead payment risk and fraud.
Okay, so you need to help me because we need to settle the debate in the room. Is it Adidas or Adidas?
It depends on where you're from.
Oh no, that's a cop-out. Cop-out, come on, what's the real answer?
So technically, it's Adidas. It's named after our founder, Adi Dassler, who along with his, actually when he split from his brother and started Puma, he founded Adidas. But the native English speakers like to call it Adidas. Also Run DMC called it Adidas, so it's just sort of stuck. So depending on where you're at.
So for the purposes today, I'm going to go with the original founding Adidas as well.
It sounds better when you say Adidas, so go with that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So it's funny, right? Because we think of Adidas as being this massive organization, but I think you've had an interesting journey because that wasn't initially your experience at first, was it?
No. So as I said, I've been with the brand for about 12 and a half years. I started with the brand in a retail merchandise planning area and then jumped into digital. And at that time, digital was sort of like a side gig. It wasn't something that really the brand was focused on. I think we had at that time around 10 employees. I was not one of the first 10. I was the next wave of folks, so I don't get the OG credit, but I was still part of the early crew. And at that time, we were very separate. We had only a shop operating in the US. We didn't have any European presence, nor no Canada presence, and nothing in LAM or Asia Pacific. Now we're in all of those places today.
So that's been obviously quite a journey over 12 years, and I'm assuming in the last 3 or 4 years, it's become a much bigger part of Adidas's strategy as well, right?
Yeah, I would actually say since the last 7 years. So if I go back to 2015, we had one of our most hyped up shoes drop. And that's where we really hit the radar of a lot of the people who wanted to abuse us and take advantage of our lacking in sort of tools or lacking in ability to stop them. And there was a massive resale market for a lot of our products that spun from that moment. And so over the course of those years, each market's been maturing, each market's been developing their own techniques regionally, and only in the last few years we've taken a more globalized approach to find a solution or a set of, say, support tactics to make sure that each market can really be protected together.
So Adidas's strapline is impossible is nothing. So let's think about the last 5 years and talk a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned as you've been on this journey.
I think I learned this when I was in school. I played sports, and my football coach always said, keep your head on a swivel. Because with fraud, it's always changing. As soon as you think you've got it solved here, there's another hole there. So I think the impossible is nothing sort of mantra to me is it really comes down to the fighting is never over. You're never going to have a static solution that just like blocks fraudsters. Whether it's chargeback and payment abuse, whether it's policy abuse, whether it's just technical loopholes, the environment is ever changing. And so it's not impossible to stop them. So you just have to keep fighting the fight.
Have you also found, though, that on that side of the business, fraudsters have also got more sophisticated? I mean, Laurent identified that in his initial presentation, right? Yes. So can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I think anyone who's dealt with bots can talk about the evolution of bots in this industry and how bots originally came on, and they were fairly simple, right? Honestly, back in the day, we used a common sales platform, so you could go and probe or try out things on, I won't say a brand's name, but on one website, find an exploit there, and then as soon as the next drop was coming into our website, they knew that we were using that platform, so they could try this technique or that technique, and they had a whole run of a playbook that would allow them to plug different, attempt different things, and we would then plug those holes, and then they would try new things, and we would work with the provider, and this cycle continues.
And to be honest, we've got a session this afternoon on bots and resellers because we know that it's such a big issue, and it's not necessarily just in the apparel space. I think anybody who is organizing events or like concerts, facing the same issues as well, right? So this is a pervasive issue across the board.
100%, yeah. I think anytime you have a desirable product, whether that is a product itself that is going to be massively like culturally important, or if it's something that just people want in a constant sort of flow of. It could be a staple, an evergreen product on your website, but if they can get it at some sort of discount, resell that elsewhere, the bot is a great way to do that because it's really low impact, really high impact, really low effort, and it can really fly under the radar depending on how sophisticated these bots are now.
So we've talked about the bad guys, and I think it's interesting because when Laurent and Michael founded the company, the idea was like, let's not worry so much about the bad guys, let's really focus on how do we create a great experience for the good guys. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about customer service and the customer journey?
Yeah. First, I'll say that's hard, right? I think the bad guys get the headlines.
Yes.
And so it's really easy to have the team start focusing on how do we stop the bad guys. But really, I think the point was made earlier, it's really how do you protect the 99% of people who aren't abusing you? How do you make sure that their experience is great? And I think for us, we do a lot to build membership programs. We do a lot to engage with consumers with our customer service centers that is more than a transactional, hey, let me help solve your problem. And so I think where we're looking to go is to really invest in those areas to make sure that we know them and they know us, and there's a stronger bond between the two of us. One of the things that, I was just looking at one of these great demos over here, and I was thinking about how our customer service team could really benefit from an integration from the utilization of a tool here. And that's just not really the thinking that we've historically had, is how do you bring tools like that to the forefront of the consumer service agent so you can create barriers where you need to, or you remove barriers where they're not needed. And you can actually service the consumer in a better, more appropriate way at a touch point that's not your typical transaction. So non-transactional touch points are a focus for us.
And I think that's a really interesting point because many of you out there, I'm sure, have customer care organizations. We know historically that becomes one of the main contact points if customers have had a bad experience. Also know that customer care, there's a high churn in terms of employees. And it's tough, right? Because that's often your front line, that's your first face that the customers are dealing with. And so I think there's almost those unintended consequences, which we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, where if you can reduce the friction and increase approvals, it also means that you get happier customers calling into customer care, and that fundamentally can change the role of customer care in the organization, right?
Indeed, it does. But again, the bad guys get the headlines, so it's tricky. We're a brand, and a lot of brands out there use NPS, Net Promoter Score, to determine how do consumers feel about us. Fraudsters also know that we look at that with a lot of weight, and if they can continuously give feedback about how our policies are tough or how we're being too difficult, we'll take our policies down, making it easier for them to continue to abuse us. So you have to balance the information that you're getting in with the service that and toolkit that you're putting out there to provide the most accurate ability to understand the consumer's need and to give them the trust that they deserve to either transact and get support or maybe to shop elsewhere. Right.
And so I think one of the realizations through this whole last couple of years around digital commerce is that you've got to view the customer journey as a holistic element, right? You can't chunk it out and try and manage it in completely different teams, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be effective at servicing the customer or maximizing customer lifetime value, which is the theme of the conference, right? So how do you bring that concept of like maximizing customer lifetime value to life at Adidas?
The first thing we do is look at where do we have friction points, and those friction points might be direct from consumer service feedback. They might be from some other internal monitoring, and we really try to go in and understand what are the behaviors that caused that friction, and then what are the results of the consumer's behaviors after that friction point. And then we try to prioritize that and fix at that friction point if it needs fixing. So the biggest thing that we try to do is figure out how do we give the consumer the best experience with our brand at any digital touch point. It might just be browsing, it might be purchasing, but if we're sensing or identifying friction points along that journey, we need to remove them or introduce them, as the case might be in some abusers.
Great. So let's switch gears a little bit because we've had the pleasure of working together for about 18 months, a year or so, at least. So when we started working together, we were really focused more on chargebacks, which, again, you mentioned that you've expanded as an organization across the globe digitally. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that journey in itself and what you were trying to do? Almost, I'm assuming like whack-a-mole to some degree, right?
It is a bit like whack-a-mole. Honestly, depending on which country I'm talking about, it might still be a little bit more like whack-a-mole. I think trends change, tools change, our partnerships change. And we found a lot of success with the recent set of partners that we're using. And that's really helped in the chargeback space. But we still continuously see chargebacks come through as it relates to service. Less so about fraud. I think we used to see, we'll call it a 70-30, and now it's a 30-70, where service-related fraud is where it's at. And so the evolution has been, again, a bit like that whack-a-mole, but how do you put the guardrails in place to ensure that you're not having what I'll call real chargebacks, or chargebacks that are really troublesome, and you move them into chargebacks that are largely within your control, and within your control, whether that's operational processes or other service providers or whatever. And that's where we've sort of migrated our chargeback issue to.
And so at the back, you just mentioned it, we were talking about how you like process and operations and making sure there's clear outcomes.
Love it.
How would that play out globally? Because obviously there's different expectations, I'm assuming, in different regions, and trying to look at things holistically across somewhere like Adidas, which is obviously operating in almost every market. How does that play out?
It depends on the day, and it depends on the process, to be honest. We have a couple really mature markets, and we like to use those markets as sort of like the standard setters for those less mature markets. And we operate oftentimes in a definition or facilitation role to upskill, to onboard, to level up these markets that don't have that. But you have to be aware of market nuance. We were talking earlier before about how dispute management works in the Americas, or in America, the US versus Brazil. And you have to be very aware of the nuance and the extra effort you may have to put in to win, or just the fact that the rates themselves may not ever be exactly the same. So we're in a role where we're trying to bring in what I'll call guardrails and guidance, but we have the ability to flex and tweak as each country or market might need. The Netherlands uses Ideal as a payment method. It's a direct call to the bank. It doesn't really have as much of the abuse because it's a bank account. But we still want to stop policy abusers. So we still run this through a risk engine. And this is an area where we had to have a conversation with the market owners to say, hey, this is something that, we don't see the financial risk necessarily, but we do see abuse to the brand, abuse to our policies that we still need to protect. And this is a way that we can address that.
Cool. So sometimes, I've talked to a lot of customers in the last couple of years, and the analogy I like to sometimes use is when you deal with an issue like fraud or chargebacks, it's almost like throwing a rock into a pond, and that initial splash you get is effectively dealing with the issue at hand, but then you get these ripple effects and almost like unintended consequences. So you were really looking to try and fight chargebacks, but what have been some of the other unintended consequences or the ripples of being able to tackle that?
All sorts of unintended consequences with this, right? I think first and foremost, when we're looking at just straight commercials, you're looking at a distance in time between a transaction that's taking place and when a chargeback's coming in. Unless you have a mature market who's able to see and understand the way that P&L is working, you might not understand the problem that's facing you. And so we had to go through an education exercise. So the unintended consequence there was really letting them know that their business wasn't maybe as strong as they thought it was because of some other activities that were happening. The other big one is around inventory utilization. So, we have a lot of products on our website, a lot of products that are desirable, and a lot of people want to buy and resell them. And so putting in protections that might stop sales, that might even be full price sales, have a consequence on the commercial value, or the commercial goals rather, but lead to inventory being available for our good consumers, the people that we want to purchase, the people that we trust. And so this isn't one of those, again, education situations where we have to say, we have to sacrifice maybe this known guarantee sale here to make sure that we have really a healthy sale afterwards.
That's great. And obviously we talked earlier about one of the unintended consequences being around customer care as well, right? That by being able to fight chargebacks, understand what was going on, being able to trust the identities of people coming to you, again, it reduced the number of calls coming in to customer care too, right?
No doubt. I think, I think we probably all have the same drivers in our customer contact centers. Probably it's mostly where's my order, or something related to the supply chain area, unfortunately. Or it's related to, hey, I'm not able to purchase this. And for us, we did see a spike once we originally started blocking some folks because their behaviors were no longer allowed. But then things mellowed out, and then the focus shifts, as it does, into a different area. So then you have to, again, get your consumer service agents up to speed on what is the new trend. I would advise anybody who's not really closely connected with your CS team, get closely connected with your CS team. They're the front line. And this is an area that we have really, in the last year, spent a ton of time really connecting to, understanding what are their operational processes, how do they train their staff, where can they communicate feedback of the trends that they're seeing back into the business so we can react and respond as opposed to it just being a one-way conversation.
Great, so you've teed my next question up fantastically. Thank you, Brian. You're welcome back on the stage anytime. So global supply chain, we know it's been in the news a ton recently, right? And then trust, because like so many really large organizations, you don't just go direct, right? You have partners and suppliers that are also a key part of your ecosystem and providing customers with a great experience. So can you talk about kind of, as you think about trust within the global supply chain, what does that mean to you?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think firstly, because we operate in so many different countries, we use so many different partners, and those partners have different levels of maturity in terms of the data that they can provide to us, the speed of that data that they can provide to us, the accuracy of it. Mm-hmm. So trust with us in that particular space comes down to really just having honest conversations about what can we get and how can we utilize what we have to make the right decisions. That might be one of those situations where we have somehow consumers bypassed an address verification check and is shipping, I'll say 50 boxes to a single house. We should have a relationship with our carrier that says, hey, this seems a little bit fishy. Should we do this or not? And thankfully we have partners who do that in some markets, and in some markets we're still developing those. But I think trust with our carrier partners is all around having honest conversations about where we see, again, the trends and the abuse happening and how do we prevent it, because it doesn't really help them or us if this is happening.
I think, I've spoken to a lot of people in the audience, and that last mile where you are relying on third parties to get product into consumers' hands, and we talked about changing consumer behavior, I think returns and INR, or item not received, is definitely an area where there's still a lot of work to be done, right? It's a gray area for a lot of companies. Yeah,
returns is tricky. And the industry's changing right now. Like we know a bunch of brands, so firstly for years and years and years, it's been free returns, make it as easy as possible. Even give guidance to purchase two so you can return one. And now we're seeing that there's some of those leaders in that sort of space have pivoted.
Yeah.
And so the consumer's expectations are also pivoting. But I think the interesting thing is around the speed of business today allows resellers to purchase products from my brand, from your brands, to put it on a physical shelf. You have a 30-day return window, 60-day return window, maybe 100 days. If that hasn't sold out by day 99, they can process a return on your website. send it back to you, you give them a full refund.
Yeah.
And so the way in which we look at returns, which has typically just been the cost of doing business, is now actually business working against us. So we have to be much smarter with how we develop guidelines, processes, and information for our consumer service to help stop some of that activity from happening. I think Nike famously, I think last week, put out a new reseller policy, and that's great. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more brands take that sort of hardline approach to ensure that this sort of abuse can't happen as rampant as it has been.
So, last set of questions. I want to change focus a little bit, because one of the things I've seen definitely in the last couple of years, as digital commerce has become more of a central part of companies' businesses, is there's been a cultural impact. And in fact, actually, Jenna and Shelley are going to talk about that on the main stage panel later on today. And I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of how the expectations of your key stakeholders and executives and kind of what you report out, how have they changed for you in your journey for the last few years?
I think they're more curious now than ever before. I think every time I used to talk about fraud or talk about risk, it was always, what's the chargeback number?
Yeah.
What are our bank fee costs? What's our our bad debt or write-offs? And it was honestly really boring P&L stuff. Now it's conversations about, hey, this is a scheme that's happening. Hey, this is a scheme that we know is happening within the industry. Hey, did you hear about this thing that was happening there? And the conversation becomes much more about interest and engagement and the story that hopefully leads to, and in our case, thankfully has led to investment to stop some of those abuses. But first and foremost, you have to have the data to be able to quantify what it is that's actually happening. And you may not have all of the information, but you have to be able to, in a sense, bring visibility to the problem, have an engaging conversation, hopefully, about the problem to get the support. And for us, that's been our history. It's looking at some of the reseller schemes, looking at some of these, freight forwarder schemes, looking at some of these policy abusers. These are really interesting techniques that are being used. And honestly, sometimes the executives really like to hear interesting stories, and you can get great support if you can land it.
So, obviously, we don't stop here. We keep going. How has this changed the way you think about your role in the organization and how you look kind of moving forward as well?
Yeah, I think right now it's my focus is really on two things, and I've mentioned them already. It's how do I upskill and arm our consumer service teams with the best information possible to service the guest in the appropriate way, and then how do we get our hands around all the different ways that we can be abused? How do we bring visibility to it? How do we tell a cohesive storyline? How do we present not just, hey, this is where we're at, but this is actually where we should be? This is not stuff that's easily like benchmarking in the industry. You can't go to the executive and say, oh, such and such industry is losing this much. This type of abuse is only recently starting to even be talked about. So we have to figure out the way to sort of land the narrative to keep those investments, to keep the engagement coming within our space there.
So, impossible is nothing is the tagline, but as you look out in terms of what's the impossible thing that you're like, all right, this is something that I'm personally focused on, professionally kind of addressing?
Honestly, returners. Like the returning thing to me is driving me nuts, and I want to stop that. That's my impossible dream, I guess, is to figure out a way to minimally impact business while stopping this return abuse from happening, because it's an industry-wide thing that is just it's just really nasty.
I think a lot of people in the audience would agree. I mean, excuse me, there's so much written about returns right now and how to manage them and how INR, for example. So I think there's a lot of people not really right in line with you right there.
I think the thing is, before we probably didn't do ourselves favors because we just inherently trusted all of our consumers, and we set some really lax policies about how quickly we would refund and some of the things that were around helping people interact with our brand. And if you did purchase a shoe size that was not the right size, we want to get you in the right shoe size as quickly as possible. We don't want you to have to wait till that product comes back and verify it, and then the money goes back to you, and maybe that shoe's still in stock. We want to make it as quickly and seamless as possible for you. And unfortunately, this rampant abuse has caused us to take sacrifices in that good consumer's experience to protect. And we have to find out how to bring that back, but also do so in a way that keeps us from taking the abuse that we've had.
Perfect. So we've asked all the panelists the same question. The theme of today's conference is impact. Brian, I feel like, what does impact mean to you?
I think impact for me is about putting the consumer at the forefront of what we're trying to do, giving them the best and most appropriate experience with our brand to hopefully drive our top line sales, limit our bottom line expenditures, and weed out those abusers who aren't there for good reasons, but are there for just their own selfish ways.
Perfect. Brian, thank you so much for joining us on stage today.
Thank you.